Okay, we're back. And what is social psychology? That is an excellent question. I remember when I was an undergraduate majoring in psychology and I was taking social psychology, and I thought that sounds like an oxymoron, right? Like psychology is the study of the individual, really. And so, what is this social psychology? And I'm just going to give you fair warning that for me as a psych major, and this might be true for you also, social psychology seemed really super intuitive. I really got everything that they were talking about in class and in the textbook. And then where I stumbled was that I couldn't remember all the different terms for all the different phenomena. So be careful. It's social psychology lures you into a certain sense of confidence that is oftentimes surprisingly incorrect. You shouldn't be feeling like that necessarily. You have to really get the terms for everything. So besides being focused on terms, what is social psychology? Well, it is the scientific study. I always like to emphasize that part, right? Because psychology is a science. So it's the scientific study of, for one thing, social thinking. And my example that I gave in the previous video, how we perceive others is part of social psychology. But it's also part of how we perceive ourselves. How do we think about ourselves as we move through the world and interact with other people, and how we think we're being perceived by other people, right? Things like that. Social thinking also includes what we believe, our attitudes about things, right? Some of the things that we believe are objectively true, and some of the things that we believe are objectively false, but it doesn't really matter to us. We believe what we believe, and we're all allowed to believe what we believe, right? Social thinking also includes judgments that we make, when we're deciding whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, risky or safe, all these kinds of things. Those are judgments, and that's part of social thinking. Social influence refers to, the impact of culture on, for example, our social thinking, or the impact of culture on our behavior. Social influence also refers to, when we're in any kind of group, how the pressure to conform exerts itself. So that we may find that we behave differently when we're around other people than we would if we were by ourselves, or if we had the option of being more influential in the group. So a lot of times we go along to get along, and there are these different kinds of pressures that groups exert on us to ensure that we'll go along and that we'll conform. Now, persuasion is a little bit more direct than conformity is. Conformity, we sort of pick up what the rest of the group is doing, and so we choose to behave in accordance or not. In persuasion, a person is trying to get us to think or act in a certain way. And so, for example, advertisements are persuasions. Propaganda is persuasion. A direct request is a persuasion, right? So a person may ask us to do something and we may or may not comply. Persuasion is also exerted by authority figures who attempt to get us to behave in certain ways, and they expect obedience because they are authority figures. So persuasion covers a lot of different things, but the main theme that runs under all of them is that there is some kind of attempt directly to get us to change our behavior or our attitudes. Social influence generally looks at how groups behave, sort of how, a group can come to a decision, or how a group determines who the leader within the group is, or the dominance hierarchy within a group would be something that would be part of social influence. So there are a lot of different topics that we'll be covering under social influence. And then there are the social relations, that are things that are interpersonal interactions. So, the development or the expression of prejudice, the aggressive behaviors or aggressive attitudes that people might hold, attraction that people hold towards each other, or, intimate relationships are part of social relations. And then the helping behaviors, being altruistic, or being an inactive observer in a bystander situation, those kinds of things. So those are the things that we'll talk about under social relations. So you'll notice these are the three main themes in social psychology that we'll be talking about across the quarter. So here is the common reaction that people hear whenever they talk about social psychological findings. Oh, it's just common sense. You hear about a study that scientists, social scientists conducted, and a layperson so often, and I hear it on the news when they're reporting the results of a social psychological study, the newscaster will say, well, I mean, they got money for that, or, I could have told you that. What they're basically saying is that social psychology is merely common sense. So is that true? Well, let's talk a little bit about aphorisms. Aphorisms are present in every culture. Every language has its own aphorisms. So I'm going to focus on English aphorisms because that's the language that we should all be sharing. So let's talk about common sense as expressed through these sayings that people repeat all the time. And they oftentimes will say it like it's a piece of advice. Like, for example, they might say things like, oh, opposites attract, to explain why this couple is together, right? Oh, well, I mean, it makes sense because opposites attract. But then there's another aphorism that says birds of a feather flock together. And so they'd say, well, that's why this couple's together, because, birds of a feather flock together. Similar people will find each other, or maybe they became more similar as they spent more time together, or something. That these aphorisms give us these ready-made explanations for what, in fact, are two opposite outcomes, right? So the common sense tells us that either one of these couples makes sense. We shouldn't be surprised by the existence of either of these couples. But science helps us to figure out whether one of these is more likely than the other, or if one of these will have a longer, more successful relationship than the other, or something like that. How about this aphorism? Absence makes the heart grow fonder is the aphorism that represents the one on the left, where it's saying, I miss you, I miss you, I miss you, I miss you across this page. Out of sight, out of mind is the opposite aphorism, right? Like, as soon as you're gone, your romantic partner will forget about you. We have an explanation ready-made to explain either outcome of, let's say, a long-distance relationship, or, a romantic couple where one of them gets deployed to a military zone, or gets, goes off to graduate school or something. You have a ready-made explanation for either outcome in the form of an aphorism. They come back and they go, oh, my romantic partner missed me so much that they came and surprised me wherever I was and proposed, and now we're getting married. And you go, well, you know what? That makes a lot of sense, because absence makes the heart grow fonder. Or the person comes home and says, oh, we broke up, we couldn't make it at this long distance. And you have this ready-made aphorism. Well, of course you broke up, because out of sight, out of mind, right? And that's the thing about common sense, is that when we exert common sense, we're not necessarily that concerned about being contradictory. We don't really mind that there's an equal and, an equally powerful, equally well-known opposite outcome that we have a phrase for. How about this one? Too many cooks spoil the broth versus two heads are better than one. Okay, so if too many of us are all bound up trying to do this, it might ruin the outcome. But if I try and do it by myself, that might ruin the outcome. Again, we could explain any outcome using aphorisms. And that's really what's wrong with common sense. Social psychology is not common sense. I'll get into what it exactly is, but I'm going to say, based on, my examples from aphorisms, it's not common sense. What about it's common sense because the media person could have told us this is how the research would have come out? What the media person is actually displaying is what's called hindsight bias. So in hindsight bias, and this is something, of course, that social psychologists have studied to death, in hindsight bias, the person makes a prediction before the event, but probably, in their head. So before the thing happens, you say, I think it's possible that Luna Runner might win, but I'm not sure. After the event, the person says, I knew it. I was certain. That's hindsight bias that she's displaying after the event. She's saying, I knew that's what was going to happen. I should have probably put a different picture in here, but I didn't want to edit what somebody else had created. I'm going to make a full confession right now. I'm a Broncos fan as far as my pro football team, so you guys all can be mad at me right now. But, I did my PhD in Albuquerque, and I watched that team every Sunday for 5 years. And it's hard to not be loyal to your team, right? And so they made it to the Super Bowl for what was the, I'm trying to remember, I kind of repressed all the appearances that they made in the 80s. So I think they made it 3 times in the 80s. So in the 90s, they made it to the Super Bowl. And at this time, and now I was living in the Seattle area. And so I hadn't seen them playing much that season because we see the Seahawks up here. And so when I heard that they had made it into the Super Bowl, I thought, oh no, gonna lose. I don't like it when they make it to the Super Bowl. Then all the announcers were talking about how well they had done this season. And they were actually the favorite going into the Super Bowl. And I thought, oh no, you are jinxing them. There's no way they're going to win if you keep saying that they're supposed to win. And so I went into the Super Bowl completely convinced that they were going to lose. And I was so convinced that they were going to lose. Back in the 80s, I had gone to like watch parties for the team and stuff because, the people around me liked them and stuff. So I went to watch parties and it was just devastating to watch them just perform so horribly. And so I decided no watch parties. Nobody I knew up here in the Pacific Northwest was having one anyway, so it was safe. But I sat by myself and I said, I'm not wearing my shirt. I think that'll jinx them. I'm not wearing my hat. That'll jinx them. I'm not doing anything. So Sunday I did show up. I had my shirt on. I had my hat on. I'm starting to soften, but I didn't want to watch it with anyone else. And as the clock ticked down and it was official, they were going to win, I didn't even blink an eye. I started yelling, I knew it. I knew they could do it. I mean, just like classic hindsight bias, just perfect that you would immediately change. I had been saying it out loud. It wasn't even just a mental thing that I was saying, I don't think they're going to win. I was actually saying out loud, oh, you're jinxing them. They're not going to win. I don't know if I'm going to watch it, this and that. And then as soon as they won, I started saying, I knew it. That's the hindsight bias. So why don't we just do that for social psychology? Why don't we just say, we knew that already. Seems like we didn't need to do the research after all, right? I could have just told you how the research was going to come out. Well, it turns out, for one thing, the studies don't always come out the way that the hypothesis predicts it should. So we do need to do the science. Interestingly enough, if we were to base all of our social psychological principles on a researcher and their 5 friends, we might not have a very good picture of what humans do when they're in groups versus alone, or the effect of culture on behavior, or any of the things that we know, if we just relied on each individual researcher and their 5 friends. Luckily, we use the scientific method so that we can make predictions in advance, collect objective data, and see whether the predictions are supported or not. So I'm going to go with the fact that science does not make its judgments based on the hindsight bias, but instead makes predictions and then sees whether they're supported or not, means that social psychological science is not merely common sense. Other issues that we're going to be addressing throughout the quarter, you're going to notice that diversity is a continuous theme throughout social psychology. I've just got a picture here of one kind of diversity that we see between cultures, which is individualism versus collectivism. That's one kind of factor that a culture might differ from another culture on, and that can have an impact on the values and the behaviors and the attitudes of the members of those cultures. But that's just one example of the kinds of diversity that we're going to talk about. One of the things that can be a little bit frustrating as a student who's looking for certain kind of diverse topics to be raised is that in social psychology, and generally in most areas of psychology, diversity is sort of just woven into the different topics. It's not like we have a separate chapter or section where we're going to talk about, atypical or minority, we don't do that. We integrate it all together. And so it's just this running theme that not everybody behaves the same way. And there are a lot of reasons why they might not. The picture I've got here has to do with culture. The sex of the person may have an impact on how they behave, the things that motivates them or dismotivates them, things like, attitudes that they hold, things like that. So sex may be a big factor. Sexual orientation might be a big factor. Race, age, just I'm kind of off the top of my head thinking of, just a subset, socioeconomic status, level of education, northern latitudes versus southern latitudes, or more equatorial, I should say, northern versus more equatorial versus very southern, because of weather. I mean, there's just so many different things that can impact a person's behavior and culture and all those kinds of things. So just be braced that this is something that's going to run throughout the different topics. We will bring it up as appropriate whenever it is known through scientific evidence that certain groups behave differently or whatever. I'll make sure to highlight those things. How about what you might have learned as the term nonconformity? But in social psychology, we talk about cultural norm violations, because nonconformity is not necessarily the opposite of conformity. A lot of times people's efforts to be different, to be nonconformist, actually causes them to seek out other people who are nonconformist in the same way that they are, which then means that they're kind of just conforming with a different group. So what we're talking about is cultural norm violations. And so I just pulled some pictures of, people being different from, expectation or whatever. The one in the bottom right corner, you might be wondering what that is, but it's actually a study that was conducted by Stanley Milgram, where he had graduate students run through in a lecture hall singing Up in the Air, Junior Rangers, and, pretending like they were flying. So cultural norm violations are a component of diversity, because some people within a culture behave differently than the culture expects them to do, right? And so those are really important. A lot of times in psychology, we're really interested in the themes that don't follow expectations, because that gives us more information about the themes that do follow expectations. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and so one of our areas in cognition is perception. And the best way for us to understand how the visual system works is when we see, visual illusions, where the visual system doesn't draw the right conclusion, right? The visual system makes a mistake. That gives us a lot of insight into how the visual system generally makes sense of the world. The same thing is true here with cultural norm violations. When people behave differently than you expect, it gives us a lot of insight into, okay, why did I expect them to behave a different way as the researcher? Why is the cultural expectation different? In what ways is this a norm violation? And so those are really important pieces of information. All right, I'm going to stop here, and we'll come back in the next section, and we'll talk about the different theories that have informed social psychology.